Competition in the 21st century is not between organizations, it's between supply chains. This is another area where manufacturing and service industries differ a bit in our analysis. Global supply chains are especially prevalent in durable goods, tech products, clothing, footwear, textiles, furniture, and plastic goods. Odds are, though, even if you're a small to mid-sized company, you're reliant on external organizations that have an increasingly global footprint. In the auto industry, more than 70% or more of vehicle components come from outside suppliers. So the automobile is only as good as the supplied parts. And we've seen the havoc that can occur with dispersed and complex supply chains both during and well after the pandemic. While the initial blow to the supply chain came as a result of Chinese plants that build parts or assemble goods for global manufacturers being shut down by the early coronavirus outbreak, one of the reasons the supply chain took such a hit during the pandemic was that few organizations truly understood the reach of their supply chain. To put this into perspective, in the automotive industry, each car has about 30,000 parts, which includes everything down to the smallest screw. Most OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers, were familiar with their Tier 1 and possibly Tier 2 suppliers. But that's where things get a little murky. To make sure we're on the same page, Tier 1 suppliers supply products, which are usually parts directly to an OEM. A Tier 2 supplier supplies parts to a Tier 1 supplier, while Tier 3 suppliers typically supply raw or close to raw materials to both the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. Here we can see a simplified example of how these Tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers might support Anheuser-Busch's supply chain. In reality, though, they are far more complex than this. While not every major manufacturer will be producing products with tens of thousands of parts, when you consider the number of products or SKUs, stock keeping units, of all products a company produces, you still have an extraordinarily complex global supply chain. The pandemic reinforced to every organization that we need to get a better handle on understanding our supply chain. We can do this through supply chain mapping. Supply chain mapping requires gathering information about your suppliers, their own suppliers, and the people who work to make sure your supply chain flows on a global map. But supply chain mapping isn't just a one-off exercise. It's an ongoing activity as you get more information and as your supplier base and supply chain changes. And these maps can end up looking pretty overwhelming, like these examples. Why go through all this effort? First, it creates supply chain transparency and visibility. It helps you to identify potential risks and make strategic decisions to minimize that risk. And it helps as you work to improve ESG, or environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria, as we seek to better understand and improve the potential environment and social risks of an investment prospect. This is where we can ensure our supply chain is in alignment with our underlying purpose, vision, and values. There are a lot of great ways to measure how effective your supply chain is as well. Supply chain managers make scheduling and quantity decisions that determine the assets committed to inventory. We usually express this as a percentage of assets, as shown in this equation by dividing total inventory investment from our annual report divided by total assets. If we look at the major retailer Home Depot, we can see that they typically have about a quarter of their total assets committed to inventory. That may seem like a lot, but these values look different when we compare them across industries. For retail, Home Depot is considered a leader. Let's look to the top of this table. In manufacturing, the norm is having about 15% of your assets committed to inventory. Here, our inventory or industry leader is Toyota, coming in at 5%. Consider that. 5%, even though each vehicle contains somewhere around 30,000 individual parts, with 70% or more of vehicle content coming from outside suppliers. It's truly impressive. The second common measure of supply chain performance is inventory turnover. Inventory turnover is computed on an annual basis by taking our COGS, or cost of goods sold, from the annual report and dividing by average inventory investment. In this PepsiCo example of the cost of goods sold is $14.2 billion. Total inventory is the sum of raw materials at $0.74 billion, work in process at $0.11 billion, and finished goods at $0.84 billion, for a total average inventory investment of about $1.69 billion, giving us an inventory turnover of 8.4. That means the inventory is turned over completely 8.4 times per year. Again, this is very dependent on industry. We can again see the stats for our industry leaders. Want to see how Toyota compares with their competitors? Do a Google search for any other automotive industry. For example, Ford calculates their turnover by the quarter and is typically between 9.5 and 10.5 inventory turns per year. And these small differences in inventory turns between competitors equate to billions of dollars when we consider the scale of these massive and far-reaching supply chains. So, what's the difference? Toyota views its suppliers as partners, and they are given the same respect, challenge to grow, and support that is offered to internal employees and teams. As Jeff Liker writes in The Toyota Way, auto industry suppliers consistently report that Toyota is their best customer and their toughest. We often think of tough as difficult to get along with or unreasonable. In Toyota's case, it means that it has very high standards of excellence and expect all of its partners to rise to those standards. But this isn't just something Toyota has learned to do well. Honda and BMW have taken similar approaches to developing their supply chains. Recently, BMW has set the stage for partnering with suppliers across its network with a focus on ESG. Google BMW supplier management to read more about the work they're doing to cut CO2 emissions and recognize innovations across the supply chain through their BMW Supplier Innovation Award. In addition to creating clear guidelines, measures, and expectations, we can do more to partner with our suppliers in meaningful ways. For over 25 years, Toyota has been sharing knowledge with its suppliers, as well as other organizations, not-for-profits, and community organizations through TSSC. It was originally named the Toyota Supplier Support Center, hence TSSC, but has changed slightly the name to reflect a growing emphasis on community engagement. Still going by TSSC, but representing the broader Toyota Production System Support Center. To better understand the level of commitment Toyota made in the early 90s to developing their suppliers, let's take a trip back in time to when the announcement regarding the opening of TSSC went out to employees. So bear with me, I'm going to read a few paragraphs from the release to give you a sense of how Toyota lives the principle. Respect your value chain partners by challenging them and helping them improve. Toyota, which sells more than 1 million vehicles annually in North America, has committed itself to producing a large portion of those cars and trucks locally and to maximizing the local content of those vehicles. By 1994, Toyota management expects to be purchasing as much as $3.82 billion in parts and materials a year from local suppliers at its U.S. operations, and to be importing parts and materials from U.S. suppliers worth an additional $1.46 billion annually. North American auto parts suppliers thus view Toyota as a potentially huge customer for their products, and they have been stepping up their efforts to cultivate or expand business with the automaker. As a growing number of suppliers, those efforts include measures for raising quality and cost competitiveness, which have emerged as the most decisive factors in the suppliers' business negotiations with Toyota and other Japanese automakers. Engineers at Toyota plants in North America work with local suppliers to resolve specific issues in connection with individual items. More and more, North American suppliers, however, are expressing an active interest in redesigning entire manufacturing systems to achieve the kinds of quality and productivity associated with lean production systems that Toyota has refined. In response, Toyota has dispatched engineers to work with some of those suppliers for periods of up to several months. Those engineers have helped the suppliers streamline production flows, improve processes, and implement systems that motivate line employees to take part actively in making improvements in quality, productivity, and working conditions on a continual basis. The results in test cases to date have been spectacular, with the participating suppliers enjoying multifold gains in the efficiency and sharp declines in defects. That success has captured the attention of other parts makers, many of whom have requested similar assistance. Their requests have prompted Toyota to make support available to an expanded range of parts makers by opening the Supplier Support Center near its Kentucky plant. A senior director is later quoted in this release as saying, "The key to our success has been to earn the trust of employees by displaying trust in them. That means involving employees in designing and managing their own jobs. It worked for us in California and later in Kentucky and Ontario, and it also is working for North American suppliers who participate in the Toyota production system." So creating strong supply chains goes beyond just supply chain mapping and metrics. It lies in supporting and linking socio-technical systems that are capable of improving. This, in turn, creates stable learning enterprises across the value chain. Now, this is the type of thinking, agility, and rigor needed to navigate the increasingly challenging global supply chain. But before we think about supporting our suppliers to create their own learning organizations, we need to first create stability through fair and honorable business relations and reliable processes. This in turn enables everyone to set clear expectations. This stability and clarity creates a baseline upon which we can improve. This is what creates enabling systems that combine both the structure and autonomy to support becoming a true learning enterprise. In the very beginning of the release regarding TSSC, we hear Toyota talk about the importance of starting by growing and developing the local suppliers first. As you work to think about your supply chain partners, challenge yourself to think global and act local.